In the first half a decade of the new millennium, wrestling games had a headlock on the video game industry, being some of the most frequently played games across all current platforms, each individual yearly franchise offering different gameplay mechanics and modes unique to the designated platform. But with a new generation of consoles on the horizon, the team behind this particular game tried to design a game that would hopefully outlive its yearly update, just in case it doesn't come back for another year. Or ever. This is Rebuilding Day of Reckoning 2. At the start of the millennium, the perception of home consoles were changing, from child's toy to mainstream consumer electronics, and the market competition was hotter than ever. Former industry leaders Nintendo and Sega were struggling to fight off new market leader Sony, as tech giant Microsoft was also readying to enter the fray, with exclusivity of some third-party titles becoming the norm, leading to said third-party companies developing yearly different titles of the same franchise for different platforms. Now, this had happened a generation prior, with said title being the same game under a different name, with a possible extra stage or new feature specific to that console's hardware being the only differentiator. More commonplace now, especially in the case of THQ, who since acquired the WWF license, publish multiple different titles based on the license, with each game being developed exclusively for its designated console. This was one area Nintendo had the slight edge over all competitors during this cycle, even prior to THQ's acquisition of the WWF license. Be it WCW NWO World Tour or its sequel Revenge, it was largely believed by many that the Nintendo 64 was the platform of choice if you liked wrestling, bolstered even more so by WWF Wrestlemania 2000 and the platform's last wrestling game, WWF No Mercy, the latter being the platform's wrestling game apogee, receiving multiple spreads in official Nintendo magazine and other publications, which continued long after the game's release, which continued the trending thought process of many grappling fans that when it came to wrestling, the Big N was king and the platform of choice, thus leading to sky-high expectations for the game's follow-up, WWF Wrestlemania 18. With no other info other than a handful of screenshots, fans believing the game would be another tour de force. Unfortunately, however, after release on Nintendo's subsequent console, the Nintendo GameCube in 2002, the game did not meet the high watermark that was set by its predecessor, with many notable features missing, such as a story/career mode, blood, and the ability to edit and change the in-game roster's ringwear and clothing. A year later, the Nintendo GameCube was continually trading the number 2 spot with Microsoft's Xbox in the home console market, as market leader Sony seemed already uncatchable with the enormous success of the PlayStation 2. When it came to wrestling games, Microsoft were also recovering from a very lukewarm reception of its WWF Raw title. Over on Sony's side, the Smackdown series had a very successful recovery with the release of WWE Smackdown Shut Your Mouth, as well as entries from new multi-platform wrestling titles. As previews for the GameCube's WWE Wrestlemania 19 and Xbox's WWE Raw 2 began press cycles leading up to release, the Xbox title was showered with fan praise and anticipation, boasting a very large roster, a brand new career mode, the ability to edit in-game wrestlers, as well as custom entrance music imported from your own CDs. The same couldn't be said for WWE Wrestlemania 19. It reviewed well and was complimented for building on 18's grapple mechanics, but again was missing the traditional career mode, with no way to defend championship belts, and the new revenge mode being too different, difficult, and too repetitive. If you had an Xbox or PlayStation 2, then WrestleMania 19 was a holdover title until Raw 2 and SmackDown Here Comes the Pain released. The following year, in August of 2004, THQ and Yuke's released WWE Day of Reckoning on the Nintendo GameCube, once again building on the gameplay of both WrestleMania 18 and WrestleMania 19, while introducing the very popular Momentum Shift, where a beaten-down, weary superstar has a chance to perform his or her finishing move out of nowhere in an attempt to recreate the dynamics and dramatics of a real wrestling match. The game also brought back a more traditional story mode, greatly enhanced the Create-a-Wrestler feature, introduced Create an Entrance, the first for a GameCube wrestling game, and brought over popular match-type bra and panties match, which was newly introduced in the previous year's SmackDown Here Comes the Pain. Many GameCube wrestling fans believed this was a step in the right direction, but was it too late? As fast forward to 2005, aside from the PlayStation 2, which was enjoying another successful year, both Microsoft and Nintendo saw decreased output for their respective console offerings, as the industry was preparing for the next console generation. With Microsoft kicking off the HD era later that year, Sony's PS3 and Nintendo's Revolution rumored to release the following year, publications were already spelling the end for the GameCube. On March 31st, 2005, THQ and Yuke's revealed WWE Day of Reckoning 2, showing the first screenshots and information on the sequel, a hands-on event open to press in attendance, where they were able to choose between Kane and Booker T to try out the game's new and refined mechanics, while conducting a multiple of interviews with media in attendance, during which revealed that Yuke started work on Day of Reckoning 2 just as soon as the original shipped, with extensive research and feedback going in on what worked and what didn't work in the previous title. The first thing the team looked at was a change in the game's visual presentation. Majority of the feedback received had revealed players would like to see a more realistic graphical style, as seen in the recently released Smackdown vs. Raw. Yuke said about this by redoing the game's rendering engine to get the most realistic character models seen to date on a GameCube wrestling game. Changes to the models themselves were also made, sporting 30% more polygons, as well as improvements to sweat, blood, and pyrotechnics. The next on the list was the game's story mode, as reception to the one in the previous game was almost evenly split. Some disliked having to use a created wrestler and not the superstar of your choice, while the most major gripe being that at the time of release, some of the story being told was out of date in compared to what had been happening on WWE programming. A critique which is often unfair with wrestling, as things change so rapidly. So with that ambitious goal in mind, the team sought to enlist the help of the official WWE Smackdown writing team. When speaking to the gaming press, THQ's Matt Gregg further elaborated that it's not something that previous games have had access to, but the Smackdown writers are getting more and more involved with the authenticity of the game, and also being current, not necessarily with what's happening right now on television, but what will be happening 6 months from now, hopefully, with the idea to present a story mode that will be as up-to-date and relevant when the game ships later this year. Another area the team chose to work on following the feedback was that the first game relied too heavily on button mashing, and while button mashing isn't gone completely, there is more strategy than there was before, thanks to the game's stamina and submission systems. Greg explained, when the player enters a submission, they and their opponent get 4 options on the C-stick. Push up and you will inflict damage on your opponent's HP. Right will drain their stamina, left will recover some of your own, and down will recover your own HP. That is, of course, if your opponent doesn't guess the same as you, or they will perform a reversal. Add to that the stamina system, which was made to make the player manage their wrestler's actions and energy throughout the match by making strategic choices on what they did and didn't do. Greg noted that all changes were made in mind that the GameCube's life cycle could be another year to year and a half at best. Most publishers would be switching to Nintendo's next home console, while he didn't rule out the possibility of another GameCube wrestling game, but did stress that both THQ and Yuke's had poured as much effort as possible to make this last longer than the normal life cycle, just in case it ends up being the GameCube swan song. In the next part, as the game gears up to release, we will be taking a look at omissions, removals, and changes. We'll be covering everything from Maven to Luther Reigns, the color of John Cena's jeans, and even the Ultimate Warrior, in the next part of Rebuilding Day of Reckoning 2.